Hello, everybody. Welcome to Matt Connarton Unleashed, the television edition, or for my French viewers, the Television Edition. Didn't know I spoke French, did you? Glenn J. Willett taught me that. I think he works for Rosetta Stone. I'm just kidding. Being silly today. No jacket. I decided to skip the jacket. It's just, it's very warm out. Tends to get very warm in here, so, you know, I figured I'll just be comfortable. I'll go back to being comfortable. I tried, you know, kind of spiffing it up for a while, but maybe next week the jacket will be back. But before we get rolling on today's show, first of all, I just want to say a big thank you to everyone who came out for, we had a big event at the Healing Tree Wellness Center and Spa in Londonderry, New Hampshire this past Saturday. Norm's annual spring psychic event, Norm and Friends annual spring psychic event, and we had a lot of people there, and always fun to meet people and people who watch the show and so forth. And of course, Norm is the superstar at these events. He does psychic readings all day long. A lot of people come just to see him, but it was great to see everybody. Al Caprillion was there, and for those of you watching online in other parts of the country, Al Caprillion is kind of a meteorological, it's difficult to say that word, meteorological legend. Oh, I'm so smooth, aren't I? Here in the New Hampshire area. So it was good to see Al, and so it was a lot of fun. So thank you again to everybody. And I want to mention this coming Saturday, I have my own event there at the Healing Tree. It will be from 1 to 3 p.m. I'm going to be doing another one of my group hypnosis and meditation workshops. And if you're hearing about it for the first time, it's because this one was kind of booked on the fly. Patty Pingree, one of the owners of the Healing Tree, sat down with me and said, you know, there's been a lot of people asking since the last one that I did several weeks ago that wanted to, some people who were there who wanted to come back for another one, and a lot of people who just heard about it and want to come in and do the workshop. So we just kind of booked this one on the fly, so it's kind of last minute, but this coming Saturday from 1 to 3 p.m. I will be at the Healing Tree Center in Londonderry. So come on down. For more information, you can find that on ipmnation.com/events. So everything that you need to know is right there. ipmnation.com/events. You can find out how you can participate. And like I always say, if you're in the area, I'd love to see you. And if you're not in the area, it's worth the drive. So we've dispensed with that. And I'm going to talk about a few things. I want to get a few things in. And I know, I say that every week, and then I spend the entire show ranting about one thing, or almost the entire show ranting about one thing. But I promise you this week we're going to cover multiple topics, because I'm kind of, the things that aren't going to take very long to cover, I'm going to do first. I'm going to front load the show with things that I will probably only spend 5 or 6 minutes on, and then on to the next thing. Because I want to make sure we have time to discuss something that's on my mind a lot, something that's in the news a lot, and that is climate change. And I specifically want to address the rampant climate change denialism that exists in the Republican Party. And of course, one cannot discuss climate change denialism without discussing the senator from the great state of Florida, Marco Rubio. And of course, so you know, I am fully prepared to discuss Marco Rubio, because I have with me this bottle of water. Because as you know, if you're a longtime viewer of the show, whenever I discuss Marco Rubio, I won't do it right now, I'll save it for when we get to the topic, but when discussing Rubio, I have to do the Rubioism, which is, of course, where I gulp from this container of water while attempting to maintain eye contact with the camera as awkwardly as possible. Very important that I do that, so. In honor of the great Senator Rubio, who continues to say lots of dumb things. But so we'll get to that. I do want to remind you before we get rolling, of course, you can participate in the show. If you're watching us live on Wednesday, of course, you can call the number on your screen if you'd like to join me that way. And if you're watching and there is no number on your screen, that means you're not watching live. You're catching one of the replays. But if you want to know all the times that you can see the show, if you go to ipmnation.com/MCUTV, and that might be where you are right now watching the show, all the times are there, both when you can see the show live every week and, of course, the replay times, and, of course, links to the archive, because we do archive all the shows online at ipmnation.com. So you can participate that way. Of course, we also have an active chat room on that very same page that I mentioned, so you can log in and chat. And I try to remember to keep an eye on the chat room, so if anyone has a direct question or comment for me, I can read it. Of course, if you just want to chat with other viewers, you can do that too. And don't forget Facebook, of course. We have the Matt Connarton Unleashed Facebook page. Please like that if you haven't done so already. Even if you don't like the show, which might seem counterintuitive. Why would you watch the show if you don't like the show? But you might hate the show, but you watch it anyway because you love to hate it. I mean, there is kind of that thing, you know. Sometimes people will watch shows or listen to shows and not even really like them, but they somehow enjoy hating them so much that they can't help but watch or listen. You might hate me, but you might love to hate me. So that's okay. I always say, you know, I'd rather be loved than hated, but I'd rather be hated than ignored. So you can do that too. There's a chat room, there's Facebook, and there's Twitter. At IPM Nation is my Twitter handle, so you can use that anytime during the show or any other time to reach out to me that way. And of course, not only can you communicate during the television edition, but the radio edition of the show, which is Thursday nights at 9 p.m. on the Dr. Kevin Radio Network at dkrn.net, or you can get there through ipmnation.com as well. So lots of ways to communicate, lots of access to the show that you love or possibly, potentially love to hate. But regardless, I appreciate your being here with me, however you feel about me or the show. So quickly, I want to kind of wrap up what has sort of unofficially become a 3-part series on the death penalty. And I know what you're thinking, Matt, you said you're not going to spend a lot of time on these other topics. I know. And I tend to ramble when it comes to the death penalty, but I promise you I'm not going to spend much time on this. I just kind of want to put the bow on this for now. This will always be an issue, and it will always be an issue that I'm passionate about. But, you know, last week on the television edition, I spent the entire hour on it, and then I had more that I didn't get to the next night on the radio edition of Unleashed, and I have still a little bit more I want to get to now. So we're going to open with that, and then we'll get to the other stuff, and we'll get to Marco Rubio's climate change denialism. And I have a theory. I have a new theory of why Marco Rubio and some other people who I think are very bright people who I can't believe they're really as obtuse as they seem. I have a theory as to why they continue to deny climate change. And it's not what you might think it is. So we'll get to all that. But on the death penalty, you know, I talked a lot last week about Texas. And I talked about, you know, Texas. I don't think I got to this part of it on the TV edition. I think I did this Thursday night on the radio edition. But Texas, they're so enthusiastic about the death penalty there. They love it so much that they will actually violate an international treaty to execute people. There have been Mexican nationals in the state of Texas who have been tried and convicted for murder, who are then executed. And that's a problem. And I'm not going to get into the whole thing all over again because it will end up taking up a lot of the show. But very quickly, this is a problem because if the United States signs on to a treaty that says we will not do something, how does Texas, as a state of the United States, have the right to ignore a provision that is in an international treaty? And what I'm referring to is the United States signed on to an international treaty that says that if a non-United States citizen is tried for a crime in the United States, they have a legal right to reach out to their home government for help, for legal assistance. And in Texas, they do not allow that. And I talked specifically, again, I think it was Thursday night on the radio show, I talked about the case of Humberto Leal Garcia, which was a few years ago, which was when I first learned about this practice in Texas of ignoring the international treaty that we as a country signed on to. When Humberto Leal Garcia who was tried, convicted, and ultimately executed for murder, he requested multiple times to reach out to the Mexican government for help, which he was legally entitled to. And Texas repeatedly ignored his requests. Rick Perry's office ignored his requests. The Department of Justice got involved. Eric Holder at one point tried to call Governor Rick Perry directly. The governor wouldn't take his call. You know, this is an international treaty that we signed on to, and Texas feels that they can ignore that. And look, I'm a states' rights guy. I really am. I mean, I tend to be a little bit conservative in that regard. I do believe that individual states have a right to some level of sovereignty. I absolutely believe that in certain things, in certain ways. But I also believe that there are certain ways where it's either not practical for that to happen, like in the case of gay marriage, for example. I'm pro-gay marriage, and I think that we should figure out a way to make it so that if someone is married, if someone enters into a same-sex marriage in a state where you have same-sex marriage, where it's legal, obviously, that that marriage should be recognized nationally. And we shouldn't have this problem of, well, if a same-sex couple moves from that state to another state, now they've got all these problems, this state doesn't recognize their marriage or whatever. You know, so there are exceptions to what I think are logical exceptions to the states' rights way of viewing things. And of course, you know, you have Colorado and other places where they've legalized marijuana, but in this instance, the Department of Justice under Obama has said, because there is such a thing as prosecutorial discretion, they have said that they will not enforce that federal law in that state because that state has decided to, you know, really kind of push the limits of state sovereignty. But I support legalization, so I'm fine with it. But if the DOJ isn't going to go after anyone, if they're not going to prosecute anyone for it, and they've stated that, and they've told the state of Colorado that, then I don't see a problem. But in Texas, they are ignoring an international treaty that the country that they are a part of, like it or not, and I know a lot of them don't like it. There's a secessionist movement in Texas, in several states actually, southern states, and in Alaska. I remember back in 2012, Sarah Palin's husband, there was a little bit of controversy over his having once belonged to a secessionist organization in the state of Alaska. In Texas, there's always these good old boys talking about wanting to secede from the Union, which is fascinating to me in a way because they're so patriotic. You know, they're always wrapping themselves in the flag and talking about their patriotism, and yet they don't want to be a part of America anymore. I feel like those are two diametrically opposed viewpoints rattling around in the craniums of some of these people. But whatever. It doesn't matter. It's never going to happen. They're never going to be able to actually secede from the Union. But I don't see how the state of Texas has the right to just ignore an international treaty that we as a country have signed on to. But Rick Perry does. And the other thing I talked about last week was kind of making a distinction between people who I think make a reasonable intellectual argument in favor of the death penalty. Because I have a lot of friends who are pro-death penalty. I know a lot of people who support it, who think it's a good thing. And that's fine. You know, Ross Terrio, we've discussed it at length. It was either on this show or on Rock, Paper, Hand Grenades. You know, and a lot of people I know who've been on this show are pro-death penalty. But I kind of divide the pro-death penalty crowd. This is a hypersimplification, of course, but I kind of divide them into two categories in my head. There's the people who are pro-death penalty who can make a reasonable intellectual argument in favor of it, which I can respect. I disagree with it, but I can respect it. But then there's the other people who are so wildly enthusiastic to the point of seeming to be almost giddy over the prospect of executing people that I'm actually really kind of creeped out by. People who, it's one thing. It's one thing to be pro-death penalty, but to at least be kind of somber and solemn about it. Like if you're in favor of it, but you kind of take the attitude that, well, it's not a great thing to have to do, but we have to do it. We have an obligation to execute certain people. So, while no one's happy about it, it's just something we have to do. Which, again, I can see that. I don't agree, but I can respect that. But when I see people who are excited about it, it's kind of creepy, especially conservative Christians who, do they really think they're doing God's work? I thought God was supposed to be the ultimate judge of these people. They don't want anybody playing God when it comes to birth. They're all very pro-life, but when it comes to executing people, they're fine with that. And I think there's also an inconsistency in conservative logic in the sense that if you are conservative, part of what is endemic of your belief system is a belief that government is ineffectual, screws up everything, can't be trusted, can't do anything right. Oh, except when it comes to convicting and executing people for murder. Oh, they never get that wrong. So I find some of the pro-death penalty crowd a bit creepy. Governor Rick Perry, in that regard, I find creepy. George W. Bush, back in 2000, when he was asked about, death penalty, capital murder cases in Texas, where apparently public defenders were falling asleep during the trials, and he seemed to think it was funny. He smirked and chuckled at it. He actually mocked in an interview someone who was up for execution. Rick Scott of Florida, very creepy to me. So I talked about Texas quite a bit. I've talked about Texas a lot because it's sort of it's the death penalty capital of the United States, the state of Texas. And I kept mentioning Florida, that I was going to get to Florida. So to kind of put the bow on this discussion before we move on, for now, obviously, again, I'll be discussing this more, especially since this is an issue that's very much in play here in the state of New Hampshire where we are. Two things. I have two articles I want to quickly read. One of them is, and I don't think I ever got to this when it happened originally. This is actually from September of last year. Something from Florida. Because I like I said, I wanted to include Florida in the discussion because Florida seems to be more often than not right behind Texas in terms of the rate of executions and in their overall just sort of really creepy attitude about it. And what's really disgusting to me is when I see it being used. These are people's lives at stake here. And I read last week the study that shows that, they're estimating roughly 4% of people who are convicted of murder and sentenced to death aren't actually guilty. That's scary, but it happens, and that's why I oppose the death penalty. Sometimes people are convicted for things they didn't actually do. What I also find creepy, though, is when it is used in terms of politics and, I don't want to say it uses a political football, but actually, here, this will explain it. I'm going to read this article to you, and then you'll understand what I find kind of objectionable here. This was from last September, and I never got to this, but we'll address it now. Adam C. Smith of the Tampa Bay Times wrote this: execution rescheduled to accommodate Pam Bondi fundraiser. So this is what Adam C. Smith wrote. He's the political editor for the Tampa Bay Times. There is no graver responsibility in active state government than an execution. In Florida this week, a campaign fundraiser takes precedence. Attorney General Pam Bondi persuaded Governor Rick Scott to postpone an execution scheduled for tonight because it conflicted with her re-election kickoff reception. Quote, "What's going on down there? It's ridiculous," unquote, said Phyllis Novick, the Ohio mother of one of Marshall Lee Gore's victims, when told Monday about the reason for the delay. Gore, age 50, raped, strangled, and stabbed 30-year-old Robin Novick in 1988 before dumping her body into a Miami-Dade County trash heap. Gore was also sentenced to die for the slaying of a 19-year-old Susan Rourke, whose body was found a few months later in Columbia County. Gore was initially scheduled for execution in June, but the date was twice delayed because of legal skirmishes over Gore's sanity. After Governor Scott last month rescheduled the execution for September 10th, the date of Bondi's hometown campaign kickoff at her South Tampa home, Bondi's office asked that it be postponed. The new date is October 1st. Scott said Monday that he did not know the reason for the request, and he declined to answer when asked whether he considers a campaign fundraiser an appropriate reason to reschedule an execution. Scott said on Monday, quote, "When another cabinet officer asks for something, we try to work with them," unquote. On Monday, Bondi responded to questions with a statement saying she had made a mistake. Quote, "As a prosecutor, there was nothing more important than seeing justice done, especially when it came to the unconscionable act of murder. I personally put 2 people on death row, and as Attorney General, I have already participated in executions since I took office, a role I take very seriously. The planned execution of Marshall Lee Gore had already been stayed twice by the courts, and we absolutely should not have requested that the date of the execution be moved," unquote, said Bondi, who has long championed victims' rights. Shortly before a scheduled execution, the Florida Attorney General typically phones the governor to inform him there is no legal basis for the delay. Since Bondi and Scott began their first terms in 2011, 8 executions have been carried out, which I'm sure they're just really excited about. Gore's attorney, Ted Scher, said he had asked the governor's office for more information about why the execution was postponed, but the governor's staff would say only that it was at the request of the attorney general, that it turned out to be because of a campaign event came as a surprise. See, this is how these people think about this stuff. It's human life that, whatever is convenient for us in our political careers, we'll worry about it from that aspect. Scher said, quote, "It's very unusual. It's particularly unusual given the Attorney General's position in these cases that all we defense lawyers do is delay these executions," unquote. Bondi is fighting legal challenges to the 213 Timely Justice Act aimed at speeding up executions in Florida. So she's trying to make all this go quicker. Gotta get them through. Gotta hurry along all the killing. Quote, "Wherever one stands on the death penalty, there isn't anyone in America that believes an execution should be postponed for political fundraising," unquote, said David Donnelly, Executive Director of Public Campaign Action Fund. He also said, quote, "That Pam Bondi requested a delay in this execution shows how the nonstop chase for campaign cash has hollowed out the morality of our political system. Her moral compass is broken," unquote. The delay keeps Gore on death row an extra 21 days at a cost that the Department of Corrections estimates at about $1,000. Oh, that's interesting. I assume this Pam Bondi, she's a conservative, right? Well, what kind of fiscal conservatism is that? You delay this guy's execution and that's actually costing the taxpayers? Huh. That's a surprise. The Republican Attorney General faces no serious challenger so far, blah, blah, blah. Okay, the rest of this isn't really important. I don't know what Pam Bondi's fate was because this was last September, but it's just creepy. It's creepy to me the way these people, the way they treat this. And then today I found this. I want to read this to you, and then we'll move on to other stuff, I promise. I'm getting a little thirsty, so I can't put off the Marco Rubio stuff too long because I got to grab that water and do my Rubioism. So this is from thedailybeast.com. Says here, Florida drags down U.S. on Amnesty International's global death penalty report. It says here, U.S. executions fell last year, but a new law in the Sunshine State to speed up death row has the human rights group seriously concerned. Florida has joined North Korea and Iran as a major concern for Amnesty International's death penalty campaigners. A dubious distinction, I would think. I'm sure Rick Perry's probably kind of jealous. Why does Rick Scott's state get to be a major concern along with Iran and North Korea? Since Rick Perry doesn't care about international treaties or anything else, he probably, I'm sure, doesn't care about Amnesty International. Sorry, I digress, as I often do. At the launch of its annual report on global execution rates, Amnesty said the state's law putting an express lane on death row was seriously troubling. And that's that law that, Speedy Justice or whatever the hell it is, that Pam Bondi got signed into law that she was defending. So that is still in place, that law. We got to hurry up and get them through. Kill those people. It's bloodlust is how I perceive it. Anywho. All right. At the launch of its annual report on global execution rates, Amnesty said the state's law putting an express lane on death row was deeply troubling. Quote, one of the biggest concerns we had this year was the adoption of legislation in Florida that aims at streamlining executions, unquote, said Amnesty death penalty campaigner Chiara Sangriorgrio. I have no idea how to pronounce that name. But that's the official line from Amnesty. The Timely Justice Act, that's what it's called. I think we should rename it, though. I think it should be called the Hurry Up and Kill 'Em Act. Let's call it what it is. Timely Justice. The Timely Justice Act, signed into law by Republican Governor Rick Scott, is designed to get inmates into the execution chamber as quickly as possible once their appeals have been exhausted. Florida surpassed Texas in the number of death sentences handed down in 2013. Oh, I bet Rick Perry's seething with jealousy. He says, oh, that Rick Scott. The Sunshine State also holds the all-time record for convicted death row prisoners turning out to have been innocent. Oh. Well, on some level, that's got to really bother people like Rick Scott and Pam Bondi. No, guess what? I'm sure they don't care. Seriously, why would they care? They don't care. I'm sure they're really good Christians, though. To be a conservative Republican in this country, you have to be a good Christian. I'm sure Christ would approve of this stuff. The Sunshine State also holds the all-time... Oh, I'm sorry, I already read that. That bears repeating. They also hold the all-time record for convicted death row prisoners turning out to have been innocent. That may be because it is the only state in the union which allows a simple 7-5 verdict by a jury to consign someone to death. Oh, that's great. That's great. Things in my head now I can't even say on this program. The person from... Stuff makes me so angry. The person from Amnesty, whose name I couldn't pronounce, said, quote, Florida's Timely Justice Act is 100% bad news because it limits the possibility for challenging the death sentence. We still have unsafe convictions. Quite worryingly, we are seeing other states trying to follow suit and speed up executions, unquote. Of course they are. Overall, the number of executions in the U.S. fell last year, but America retained its position among the globe's top 5 executioners alongside Iraq, China, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. Only 22 of the world's 206 countries carried out any executions in the last year, according to Amnesty. The U.S. was the only one in the Americas. My stomach hurts. That person whose name I couldn't pronounce said, it is time for President Obama to lend his voice to the national debate, even though it is predominantly a state issue, just as he did on gay marriage. Well, he won't. because Obama is also pro-death penalty. Oh, he did make a comment that he was troubled about the botched execution that just took place in Oklahoma. Oh, good for him. Because you got to remember, it's not really that partisan an issue. It's somewhat partisan in that it tends to skew that more conservative-minded people are pro-death penalty and more liberal-minded people are opposed to the death penalty. But on this particular issue, there is a lot of crossover in both directions. The good news is, of course, that more and more conservatives are beginning to come over to the anti-death penalty side, which is good. Unfortunately, there's also still a hell of a lot of Democrats who are actually pro-death penalty, as is President Barack Obama, as was President Bill Clinton. And I won't rehash if you're a regular viewer, you've already heard it probably 5 times over, my big Bill Clinton death penalty rant. But yeah, Obama's not going to say anything. He doesn't care. I mean, Obama's the guy who is, I mean, he's like a killing machine with his drones overseas. You think he gives a crap about the death penalty? We'll get to that. Let's see. The person whose name I couldn't pronounce said, quote, oh, no, I already read that. Okay. See, I'm so upset I'm rereading things I already read. I get angrier all the time about this. While states have the right to set their own judicial penalties, there have been on capital punishments, there has been no capital punishment slowdown at a federal level. She said, quote, federal authorities have been proactively seeking the death penalty at the federal level, including in states that are abolitionist like New York. The number of countries carrying out executions has fallen by almost half since the 1990s, but last year saw a rare spike in judicial killings led by huge increases in the number of people put to death in Iraq and Iran. While 169 people were executed in Iraq, at least 369 were killed in Iran, where public hangings from cranes are commonplace. Quote, only a small number of countries carried out the vast majority of these senseless state-sponsored killings. The virtual killing sprees we saw in countries like Iran and Iraq were shameful, unquote, said Salil Shetty, Amnesty International's Secretary General. In some parts of the world, it's virtually impossible to calculate the number of executions. North Korean secrecy makes accurate analysis futile, while the number of people executed in China is a state secret. The scale of the killing is unknown, but Amnesty estimates that thousands of Chinese people were put to death in 2013, dwarfing the numbers in the rest of the world. It's got to go. I don't even want to talk about it anymore today. I'll address it again in the future, of course, but I can't even. I've got to move on to something else. I'm really mad. All right. Let's talk about climate change and Republican climate change denialism. And of course, our favorite senator from the great state of Florida. He is a thirsty man, that Senator Marco Rubio. There we go. That's my Rubioism. I have a theory about Republican climate change denialism. Now, I think that it's possible that a lot more Republicans and Republicans who either hold office or are running for office, even the Tea Party ones who tend to be kind of right-wing extremists in a lot of ways, I think it's possible that a lot of them aren't being completely honest. Well, they're politicians, but when they claim that they don't believe in climate change or they don't think that man-made climate change is a reality or whatnot, because I think they may believe in it more than they let on. But and we'll explore that in a moment. But Marco Rubio in particular has been kind of at the forefront of this discussion because he keeps saying things publicly that sound really obtuse. And this was a recent. I'll tell you what I find really, really ridiculous about some of the statements that Marco Rubio has made. But this was from Huffington Post. This was from a few weeks ago. And keep in mind, Marco Rubio, I believe, will run for the Republican nomination for 2016. And I think he has a chance at winning the Republican nomination. And I think he could be our next president. I think it's possible. But according to this, Marco Rubio got some pushback on Tuesday for his comments on Sunday that he does not believe human activity is impacting climate change. Rubio was speaking at the National Press Club on Tuesday when he was asked by an attendee at the event via a moderator, quote, "What information, reports, studies, or otherwise are you relying on to inform and reach your conclusion that human activity is not to blame for climate change," unquote. The rising GOP star and presumptive 2016 presidential candidate seemed to dodge the question, instead focusing on what climate proposals he would deem acceptable. Rubio said, quote, "I've never disputed that the climate is changing, and I've pointed out that climate to some extent is always changing. It's never static. There are things that we can do to become more efficient in our use of energies. There are things we can do to develop alternative sources of energy. There are things we can do to be better stewards of the energy resources that we have, like natural oil and gas," Rubio told the crowd, while affirming that he would not support proposals that would ban all coal and carbon emissions. Rubio, and this last sentence is critical. Rubio made the comments a day after NASA released a report that claims the West Antarctic ice sheet is melting in an unstoppable way. So NASA is saying that the West Antarctic ice sheet, it's too late to do anything about it. Now, bear that in mind. While I read to you this other article that relates to that, and this was just a few days ago, 3 days ago. This is from CBS News. Republicans divided over climate change as Antarctica rises and melts. Antarctic ice can be up to 2.6 miles thick, yet researchers say that the continent of Antarctica is rising unusually fast due to climate change. Researchers told Live Science on Friday that a combination of climate change and hot rock miles underneath the Earth's surface are flowing much faster than expected has caused the continent to rise in a similar fashion to mattresses decompressing after people get off of them. Grace Neal, the geophysicist at Newcastle University in England, told Live Science that, quote, "Closer to the site of the ice loss, that is, right next to the thinning glaciers where we do not have any GPS sites, the Earth is likely to be rebounding significantly more than 15 millimeters per year," unquote. Past research has shown these types of rebounds happen very slowly, usually over thousands of years. However, after looking at 7 GPS stations on the northern Atlantic Peninsula, Neal's research shows that uplift of the continent was happening at 0.59 inches a year. She said in a statement, quote, "You would expect this rebound to happen over thousands of years, and instead, we have been able to measure it just over a decade. You can almost see it happening, which is just incredible," unquote. Neal's research supports reports earlier this week from researchers at the University of California and NASA saying that Earth has, quote, "passed the point of no return." There's a little bit more to this, but that's the important part. That past the point of no return is part of what informs my theory about these folks, these climate change deniers in the Republican Party. Now, I'm a climate change believer, as you can easily tell. And the reason I believe in climate change is because I think roughly 97% of the world's scientists surveyed agree that there is climate change and that it's a man-made phenomenon. And to be a climate change denier, it seems to me, you have to sort of accept this theory that the vast majority of the world's scientists have engaged in this grand conspiracy with all of the world's liberals and environmentalists to use climate change as a means of destroying capitalism. That, as those words come out of my mouth, they sound to me pretty ridiculous. But that seems to be what conservatives believe. That it's all this grand conspiracy among scientists and liberals. I don't buy it. I think that there really is climate change, because if I'm not an expert in something, I tend to defer to an expert. So I'm not a scientist. And by the way, I always cringe a little bit when I hear people who are not scientists discussing science like they know something about science, like some people do. And if a scientist tells me this is what's happening, I'm going to believe it. I'm not going to assume that, well, that scientist is part of some conspiracy with liberals. And by the way, accepting climate change and accepting that we need to do things about it is not the same thing as crushing capitalism. There are ways that we can use the free market capitalist system to do things that are good for the planet. They can be done, and we'll get to that. But this, something else Marco Rubio said a couple of years ago, this was back in 2012. Marco Rubio was asked about the age of the earth, because a lot of Christians, not all Christians, but creationist Christians insist on taking the Old Testament literally. So they don't believe that the earth is really billions of years old. They believe that it's merely thousands of years old. So when Marco Rubio was asked about this, this was back in November of 2012, he was asked in an interview with GQ magazine, when asked, well, this is what he said. He declined to provide an exact estimate of the age of the earth, arguing that parents should be free to teach any origin of life theory as they see fit. Well, sure, parents can tell their kids whatever they want. Yes, there is a Santa Claus. Yes, the tooth fairy is going to leave $1 under your pillow for that tooth. Yes, the earth only is a few thousand years old. Sure. I mean, that's, parents have the right to do that. But when asked how old the earth is, this was his response. I'm not a scientist, man. I can tell you what recorded history says. I can tell you what the Bible says. But I think that's a dispute amongst theologians. I don't think I'm qualified to answer a question like that. At the end of the day, I think there are multiple theories out there on how the universe was created, and I think this is a country where people should have the opportunity to teach them all. I think parents should be able to teach their kids what their faith says, what science says, unquote. There's... I'm not a scientist, man. Well, here's the thing. If you're not a scientist, why would you then not believe what scientists tell you if obviously a scientist, by definition, knows more about it than you do? It just, look, if my car, let's say my car were making a funny noise. So I took it to John Heichel at Uptown Auto in Pinardville. Little plug for John's there. And let's suppose I took my car there and he diagnosed and repaired the problem. And then somebody says to me, hey, so what turned out to be wrong with your car? I wouldn't say, well, I'm not a mechanic, man. No, I would tell them. I would say, well, I took it to John Heichel and it turned out to be this. Because John's a mechanic, therefore he's the expert. I don't know anything about fixing a car. So I took it to someone who knows. And he told me what the problem was. And I believed him. Why wouldn't I? He knows what he's doing. So if you're not a scientist, and a scientist tells you that the earth is billions of years old, not thousands, why would you not believe him? Why would you say, I'm not a scientist, man? Why would you not say, well, according to science, the earth is billions of years old? And I realize that for a lot of conservative Christians, there are things about science that, some of these folks, for example, believe that Satan put dinosaur fossils on earth to confuse us. Yes, that sounds ridiculous, but that is what some of these folks believe. I've heard them say it. I've talked on this show about how in Louisiana, under the auspices of conservative Republican Governor Bobby Jindal, they're now teaching in public schools that the Loch Ness Monster is real. And that the Loch Ness Monster is quite probably a dinosaur, a leftover dinosaur. And that the Loch Ness Monster's presence on Earth proves that humans and dinosaurs can coexist at the same time. And therefore, that somehow proves creationism or something. I don't know. I don't even know how they manage to justify any of this nonsense in their own minds, but they do. Look, I was raised in a Catholic home, and I'm very critical of Catholicism, but one thing I do appreciate about Catholicism is they're really good about accepting the idea that maybe the Old Testament shouldn't be taken literally, because that's how I was raised. I went to Catholic school from grade 2 to grade 8. We had church on Sunday. My dad was, he is now a Eucharistic minister. Very, very devout Catholic. And we were taught, and he told me, he said, the Old Testament is not necessarily meant to be taken literally. Those are stories. Those are parables. There was not necessarily a literal Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve and all that. Which is, you don't hear the phrase anymore for some reason, but there's that phrase intelligent design, which I thought was a pretty good compromise between religion and science. Maybe evolution is real and the hand of God helped it along. Maybe God caused the Big Bang. These things don't have to be mutually exclusive, but they've become so for some reason. It's kind of like we've kind of gone backward on this stuff in some ways, at least on the right. Here's my theory, though. Marco Rubio, while he sounds to me like an absolute buffoon when he talks about this stuff, whether it's the age of the earth or whether it's climate change, I think it's possible that he and other Republicans like him actually completely buy in. Secretly. They'll never say it out loud. Because Marco Rubio does not strike me as a dumb guy. I don't think he's stupid. I think he's a smart guy. I think when not talking about things that make him sound like a buffoon, I think he actually, I think he's an articulate, intelligent man. I think it's very possible that he secretly, deep down, believes in climate change and believes, as NASA has said, and how a lot of climatologists have been saying for a number of years now, that we've already passed the point of no return on this. In other words, it's too late. And I think a guy like Rubio, who is smart, who I just don't see how he can mean these things that he's saying, I think that he probably feels, this is just a theory. I shouldn't say probably because it's a theory. I think he possibly feels that what is the point of angering his donor base? Because who controls our government, right? I always say, you've heard me say it 1,000 times, when we elect these people to send to Washington, they don't represent us. They represent whatever set of special interest groups and lobbyists and corporations, etc., own that candidate, paid for their campaigns. That's who they really work for. So, who do these people really work for? Among others, they work for the coal industry. They work for the oil companies. People who don't want to see anything done on this issue. People who don't want any additional regulation. People who don't want anyone raining on their parade. That's who a guy like Marco Rubio works for. They all work for them. Not just Republicans, Democrats too. They all work for them. Our government is owned by oil and coal and the banks and the pharmaceutical industry and a bunch of other people. That's who owns our government. So, it is not, I don't think, unreasonable to suspect that some of these Republicans, they know. They know. Yes, climate change is real. Yes, we are destroying our own planet. And yes, it is too late to stop it. So we might as well just keep going, because there's nothing we can do about it now. But they can't say that, because defeatism does not play well in politics. If you're a Republican and you really believe everything that I just said, you can't say, well, yeah, I think we've really screwed this up, and I think we're screwed, and the seas are going to rise, and we're going to see all this coastal flooding, and we're going to see more drought, and food's going to get more expensive because of that, and all this. And they can't say that. That's defeatist. That's kind of shrugging and saying there's nothing we can do about it now, so let's just give up and accept it. No one wants to hear that message. So they play the skepticism card. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying I think that this is what Republicans generally really think. But a guy like Rubio, I just can't believe some of the obtuse things that he says, that he really believes them. And he is ambitious. You can see it on him. He's an ambitious guy. He wants to be president. He's all politics. So he's going to do whatever he has to do and say whatever he has to say to get that Republican nomination. So I think it's possible that he does believe in climate change and that we're doing it, but doesn't want to do anything about it, because I think he may be thinking, why bother? It's better politics, as far as winning the Republican nomination, better politics to be a climate change denier. I will finish this article quickly, because actually, no, I won't. Because I want to mention this other thing. Not all conservatives are climate change deniers. There are the brave few who do believe in climate change and who see an opportunity, a capitalistic opportunity with climate change. And this is an article I found on salon.com. Bob Inglis says conservatives have a climate solution. Listen to this. Conservatives have the answer. We just need to raise our hands. This statement is from Bob Inglis, a former representative of South Carolina's 4th District. Inglis said that he believes conservatives are an indispensable part of the solution to energy and environmental issues. The author of this, Marcia Yerman, says, we spoke by telephone in a conversation that covered topics from his background of his grassroots organization, Energy and Enterprise Initiative, to his thoughts on fracking and renewable energy. His attitude was upbeat. He is convinced that free enterprise and accountability can pave the way towards solving America's energy concerns. Inglis was clear about the need for conservatives and Republicans to step up and lead. He noted that the climate change matter was started by liberals, so conservatives think they have no place in the dialogue. His response to this is, quote, "Don't shrink in science denial," unquote. Admitting that the Republican Party is perceived as being against climate change, he acknowledged, quote, "That is what dominant voices are promoting. My party has been engaged in a detour of populist rejectionism," unquote. Rejecting their rejectionism, he said, quote, "I'm very optimistic that things are beginning to turn and that Republicans will be offering solutions and not looking for scapegoats. As the economy improves, I think my party is going to have to offer up real solutions to succeed. You can't just sow discontent." One of the top catalysts Inglis sees is what he calls, quote, "the generational challenge. Young people are more inclined to accept science and they want solutions," unquote. So what exactly are Inglis's top points? His strategy is based on 3 pillars to a conservative and free market solution to energy and climate policy should entail these. Eliminate all subsidies for fuels, from fossil fuels to renewables. Well, that'll never happen. We already understand why. They own our government. Attach all fuel costs attach all costs to all fuels in order to get a true cost comparison, and ensure revenue neutrality to prevent the growth of government. There's a lot of good stuff here, but we're just about out of time. So I'm going to save the rest of this. I'm going to continue this conversation tomorrow night on the radio edition of Matt Connarton Unleashed, which is every Thursday night at 9 p.m. Eastern on the Dr. Kevin Radio Network. You can get to that through dkrn.net. So we'll finish the climate change discussion tomorrow night. I also want to mention, too, Elizabeth Warren said something that really slammed Obama that is not getting a lot of reporting, but it's very interesting. Not so much because of how it affects Obama, because what she said does not, but it does affect the 2016 race for the Democratic nomination and could affect Hillary. And I will explain why tomorrow night on the radio edition of Unleashed, because, we see a lot of infighting and divisiveness on the Republican side. I think it's possible we might start to see some of that on the Democratic side too. Hillary Clinton, I predict, will be attacked from the left by people like Elizabeth Warren. And I think her little attack on Obama is a prelude of what Hillary should expect. And this is going to be so interesting to watch. No matter where you are ideologically, I think the 2016 presidential race is going to be fascinating. So I'm excited about that, as you can tell. So we'll also get into that as well tomorrow night on the radio edition of Matt Connarton Unleashed, 9 p.m. Eastern on the Dr. Kevin Radio Network. And one more quick reminder, this Saturday, I will be at the Healing Tree Wellness Center and Spa from 1 to 3 p.m. doing another one of my hypnosis and meditation workshops. So come on down. We had a big group of people last time, and I think we're going to have another big group this weekend, but it's from 1 to 3 p.m. And for more details on how you can participate, go to ipmnation.com/events. And we would love to see you there. And that's going to do it for this week's television edition of Matt Connarton Unleashed. And of course, if you're watching us live on Wednesday, you know the drill. I'll be back at 4 o'clock with Norm and at 6 o'clock with Gary. So that is all for right now. I'll talk at y'all a little bit later. Thanks, everybody.